Good morning, everyone. My name is Lena Verhappen. I am the training advisor on the retail side with UFA. I will be hosting your call today with Chris Huberstay and Brent Hartke presenting for us. I will first start off with letting you know that the session is being recorded. So you're aware that everything that's being said and presented here will be recorded. And just a couple of housekeeping items before we start. Everyone who is an attendee is muted, so you will not be able to speak out during the presentation. If you do have any questions, there is a Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen. You can type your question in there. We will address all of the questions at the end of the session. So if they're not answered throughout the presentation, we will address your question at the end. And yeah, so you could use the Q&A or the chat. And with that in mind, if there are any questions at the moment, just pop it in there. And without further ado, I will introduce our presenters today. So presenting for us, I'll just flip our slide here. So this morning, again, thank you all for joining us. This morning we have Chris Huberstay and Brent Hartke presenting. Chris is joining us from Kitchener-Waterloo. He is the Director of Marketing with Dryer and Moisture Systems. Chris has been working with Dryer Master since 2013, handling marketing and sales, but also working in customer technical support every year during the harvest season. As a result, he is well aware of the types of questions that new users have about Dryer Master DM510, both before they buy and after they start using the product. Joining Chris will be Brent Hartke, grain storage and handling systems advisor for UFA. Ben grew up on a mixed farm in the Westlock area and lives just south of Red Deer. After college, Ben was involved in a grain drying research project, and from there he spent the next 10+ years servicing grain dryers, primarily mixed flow dryers, and related equipment. One of Ben's missions in life has been to help farmers understand how to properly size and operate their aeration systems to ensure they have the best product possible to market. And on that note, I will pass it over to Chris and Ben.
Thanks, Lena.
Good morning.
Good morning, everyone. Morning, Chris.
Good morning, Ben.
So Chris, we're talking about dryer controls and what makes controlling a grain dryer different from other process controls.
Yes, it's kind of interesting because you would think that grain drying, it only happens, hopefully for a month or so a year, sometimes a little bit longer, that it wouldn't be that difficult a process to control. But it turns out, even though it's only for a short time each year, it's one of the most difficult processes to control. And if you think about it, think about how a normal process or manufacturing operation works, and it happens inside with, pretty controlled conditions. Well, grain drying is not quite like that. It happens outside. The grain dryer will dry differently in different weather conditions, and obviously that can happen day to day or hour to hour. On top of that, you have a mix of possible moistures or inputs into the process, so it's not a continuous stream of the same thing coming in. You have limited information, so unless you're taking a sample of what's coming out of the dryer or going into the dryer, you really don't know what's happening. But probably the most interesting thing is something is called control delay, or we call dead time. Now, grain drying, especially in a mixed flow dryer, I mean, the product can be in the dryer for 2-3 hours sometimes. And so the problem with that is, let's say your grain is coming out a little bit too wet. And so you want to slow the dryer down a bit to make it drier. So you make a change to the speed. The question is, how long do you have to wait to see if you made the right change? And that time can be 2 to 3 hours, or the amount of time that it's in the dryer. And that takes a heck of a lot of patience, plus it makes it hard to make those kind of decisions. So that's why we call it dead time. It's like you make the decision and then you sit there tapping your toes until you see if you actually made the right decision or not. And that's really one of the things that makes grain drying really tough. That and the fact that it's outside.
So I'm going to assume that the DM510 can handle taking care of some of those hurdles. What are some of the benefits of having a DM510 on your dryer?
Exactly. I mean, that's really how Dryer Master was developed, was to solve that problem. So there's really three key things. First thing is information. So you make better decisions if you have better information. So what we have is we have real-time moisture information. If you think about how you would run a dryer without moisture information, the only way you're going to know is if you go and take a sample, and then really all you know is what that sample is at that moment. You know, the 2 hours from when you did the last sample, you really don't know what happened. Kind of the example I use is we had one of our IT guys was out in the country one night driving, and his dashboard lights went out, so he couldn't see what speed he was going at. And he's driving along, not knowing if he's going fast or slow, other than kind of feel. And so what he would do is he'd turn on his inside light in his car for a bit and to see what speed he was going on, and then he turned that off because he didn't want to be driving with that on all the time. And that's kind of like he'd have an instantaneous view of what his speed was, but then until he turned on the light again, he didn't know what speed he was going at. And so with Dryer Master, we give you that real-time moisture information at the inlet and the outlet of the dryer. The next thing is, I mean, if you think about when you're grain drying, you've got to figure out what speed to run the dryer at. And really, that's a tough thing to do, especially when you got a whole bunch of other things going on. So what the Dryer Master does is you put in a moisture set point, the average moisture that you want, and then the Dryer Master makes those decisions as to what speed to run at to get you that average moisture. Now, it's not going to be perfect because, you know, the one thing we know about grain drying is it's never perfect. There's always variability in the process, but on average, you're going to get that moisture set point. The third point, and this is real important these days, is to have remote access. So from your phone, you can be able to see what's going on at your dryer. And there's a little picture there in the hand there of the kind of information you'll have. We'll talk about that, I think, a little bit later. But you can be on the combine and be able to see what's going on in your dryer. You don't have to be at the dryer, so it frees up a lot of time. So those are kind of the three main benefits of having a Dryer Master on a grain handler dryer.
So with all that, can you explain how a DM510 works so well at controlling a grain dryer to achieve average moisture content?
Okay, so if you think about, let's say you don't have anything on the dryer other than, you know, you're going to do the manual control. Okay, so ideally, what would you like to have if you're going to make a good decision? Well, if you think about it, I'd like to know what's in the dryer, what moistures are in the dryer, and where are they in the dryer? So how much is in the hot zone, how much is in the cold zone, etc. And I'd like to know how the dryer is drying, because if I have all that information and a calculator, I could probably work out, you know, approximate speed I should be running at for the grain that's in the dryer. So what the Dryer Master does is it's automating that. So we put a moisture sensor at the top of the dryer, so we know what's going into the process. We have a moisture sensor at the bottom of the dryer, so we know what's coming out. And then we feed that information to the control panel, which is essentially a computer that does a whole bunch of calculations and says, okay, we basically know how the dryer is drying because we're looking at what comes in, we're seeing how it comes out. Okay, so that teaches us how the dryer is drying at this point in time. And then what we can do is we can figure out the best speed to run at for the mix of grain that's in the dryer. The kind of cool thing about what Dryer Master does, because it works in whether you're in Louisiana or if you're in northern Alberta, where you are, the size of your dryer, all that doesn't matter, because what the Dryer Master does is it's using real information to update its model of how the dryer is drying. So it's always predicting what moisture will be coming out of the dryer. So if the dryer, if the moisture coming out is say 14% and the prediction is 14.5, we know something has happened. We don't know what's happened. We know something has happened that's made the dryer more efficient. So we update our model, update our calculations. So it's always being tuned to the current conditions that you're facing. And that's kind of what makes it so so capable of handling so many different situations.
So how does controlling a mixed flow dryer like a grain handler differ from a cross flow dryer?
Okay, so this is kind of a fun one. So it ties in with what I said before about, Dryer Master works it doesn't really matter what kind of dryer it is, but the drying problems or issues or complexities change with different dryers. So with a cross flow dryer, you've typically got a shorter retention time. So the grain's going through the dryer faster, which usually means you're going to see more variation at the outlet of the dryer. But if you make a change to the discharge rate or the drying temperature, you're going to see the result more quickly because it's a little bit faster process. But you have to make faster control changes. With a mixed flow dryer, you've got a longer retention time, so it's naturally going to reduce the variation coming out of the dryer. But because it's in there longer, if you do have to make a change, it's going to take you longer to see the effect of that change. So you have to be looking much further ahead before you make a change. So it's each of them has their little intricacies.
So the longer retention time ends up giving you a more consistent output, is what you're saying.
Yeah, that's typically what happened. You'll see a lot less typically see less variation on the outlet with the same kind of inputs.
Good. So obviously, over drying your grain costs you both in grain weight and energy costs. Can you explain how the DM510 can help overcome this?
Yeah, so I mean, the major financial benefit I think most of our customers find is because they have more information and they have something watching their dryer all the time, they can be a little more aggressive on their set point. And so let's say the elevator takes, wheat in and say 14.5%. Ideally, you want to be delivering 14.5%. But at the same time, you don't want anything going into your bins that's too wet that you don't know about because that can get you into other kinds of trouble. But now that you've got more information and your average, you're going to be a little more accurate on your average, you should be able to deliver closer to what the elevator takes. So, for example, if you only deliver 14% and the elevator is paying for 14.5, you've lost 0.5%. And so, for example, on $8 bushel of wheat, on 100,000 bushels, you're talking $4,000. And so that's kind of the money you don't really want to give away because essentially, we don't usually say this, but you're not selling enough water. And then, when you're drying, the last bit of moisture you take out from an energy point of view is the most expensive. So to dry from 20% to 19% is a lot less expensive in energy than to dry from 14 to 13. Okay, so if you're not over drying, you're also not spending more money on fuel. And then also, if you're not over drying, your grain's not spending as much time in the dryer, which means you get more grain through the dryer in the same amount of time.
Good explanation. So what are some grain drying tips that you've learned over your many years of experience in the grain drying industry?
Yeah, I think there's a few key ones, and this has come a lot of times from our customers telling us things. The first one is interesting. You talked in a previous webinar about having 2 wet tanks if possible. Now, not everybody can do that, but if you can, besides the benefit you talked about in your webinar about being able to switch products, one of the other advantages, we had a customer in the US who did some experimentation and they used 2 wet tanks. They received into one, dried out of the other one. And they found that by tempering the grain or letting the grain sit for a few hours after harvest, that it dried, they saved about 10 to 15% on energy cost. Now, this was corn and this was down in the US, so I can't say for sure that it's the same with wheat, but the concept is really there, is that if the grain can temper a bit, it does tend to dry faster, and so you spend less money, and it'll spend less time in the dryer as well. The other thing that's real important, especially, actually with any dryer, the longer runs you can do, the better. You really don't want to be stopping and starting because you're having to heat up the grain and then it cools down, then you heat it up, and it's really hard to have consistent quality coming out if you're always doing that. So, for example, if you got 6 hours worth of drying today and 6 hours worth of drying tomorrow, you're much better if you can put those together and have 12 hours. You just see much better results. And we've seen this over and over with customers. I mean, longer run times, it works much, much better. Obviously, also, you want to take a look at the temperature outside and the weather conditions outside, and that'll affect, how you dry. And the last one here, which is, it's kind of, you think it's obvious, but some people don't do it, and you can get into trouble if you don't, which is you want to make sure your benchtop meter is calibrated before you start the season. Because, and we'll talk about this, I think, a little bit later, is when you calibrate the dryer master moisture sensor, we're calibrating to your benchtop. So if your benchtop is wrong, what we're calibrating to is wrong, and so you're not going to get the results you want. So a very good thing to do before you start the season.
Good point. So can you tell us where the moisture sensor should be located and any other requirements to make sure that you're going to be getting an accurate moisture reading?
Sure. So like I said, there's two moisture sensors. The inlet moisture sensor, we want to put, just basically at the top of the hot zone of the dryer. The idea with both our moisture sensors is we're trying to mimic what the conditions that are in your benchtop tester. Now, your benchtop tester just sits on a desk and you put a little sample in there and it takes a moisture reading. We're trying to do it with moving grain. So ideally, we want it compacted and not flowing too fast is kind of the conditions. So like I said, the inlet at just above the hot zone area of the dryer, and the outlet after it comes out of the dryer. And at Dryer Master, we've come up with a couple of we call rotary feed chutes. Has kind of a paddle wheel that meters some of the product past the sensor slowly at about 50 bushels an hour. And that's kind of, how we'd like to be placed.
So if we sort of continue on, can you explain the calibration process for the DM510?
Sure, Sam. This is kind of a very important thing. So like I said, we calibrate the Dryer Master sensor to your benchtop. But the inlet and the outlet sensors are treated a little bit differently. So the inlet sensor, most people are not going to climb up to the top of the dryer to do a sample to see what their moisture is. So when we designed the system, what we said is the inlet moisture, we don't have to be exact. What we want to know, though, is that how much it's changing by. So for us, it's less important whether it's 22 or 21%, but if it moves from 22 to 21, we know it moved 1%. So it's the change is important. So we tell people the inlet, you really don't have to calibrate very often. Basically, if it's within a point or two, that's sufficient to give good control. The outlet sensor is much more important, obviously, because that's the end of the process. And if you see a little bit on the picture there, there's a little green button next to where it says Dryer Master. And we tried to make the calibration process as standardized as possible. So you push that little green button, it'll flash for 30 seconds. And what we want you to do is you want to take a sample during that 30 seconds. So we don't just want a quick coffee cup sample. We want enough that you're taking over 30 seconds, because the whole point in grain drying is not every kernel coming out of the dryer is the same moisture. Okay, so if you just take a little cup of it, you may or may not be getting a representative sample. So we're trying to average over 30 seconds. You take a sample over 30 seconds, and with the averaging, you're going to get a better result. And then basically you put your reading into the Dryer Master panel and it does the calibration.
Great, good explanation. So one of the big misconceptions is maximum moisture content and average moisture content. Can you explain the differences between maximum moisture content and average moisture content, and why is it so important?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the next slide, Lena. I think we're flipping between slides here. I think
That one?
let's just go to the next slide and then we'll come back to this one. One back.
Oh, one back, sorry.
Yeah, one forward. Okay, so yeah, so this is kind of interesting, because if you ask most operators, what moisture they want coming out of the dryer, a lot of them, they're thinking in their mind the maximum moisture they want coming out of the dryer, because you don't want any problems in your bin with stuff that's too wet. And that's an obvious and a very smart thing to do if you don't know all the moisture is coming out of your dryer. So if you don't have a real-time moisture sensor and you're only doing samples every couple of hours, you're going to be a lot more careful in terms of how wet you want that grain to be. So a lot of people, they have a maximum moisture. I don't want anything over this percent. Whereas the way Dryer Master works and what we want the operator to think of in terms of a set point is, what's the average moisture that I want, right? And so on an average, obviously, you're going to have the same amount above and the same amount of below. So you're going to have some wet grain, probably a little wetter than you might normally expect. But if you have some dry to balance it out, once it goes into the bin and equalizes, you'll be fine. And that's kind of one of the ways that we you know, a lot of customers get to the point where they reduce the amount of shrink that they have. Lena, if we go back to maybe the slide before, I think. Yeah. Ben, I'll just explain this one, I think. This one's kind of fun because I don't know, most people, you know, if you're looking at your moisture coming out of your dryer, you're taking a sample every once in a while. This is an example of kind of continuous information. And on this graph, if people can see it, the green is the inlet moisture, and you can see it bouncing around. This is over a 24-hour period. So it's not this flat line. It's, you know, it's bouncing around. The blue line is what's coming out of the dryer, and you can notice there's a lot less bouncing around because I think this is on a mixed flow dryer. And so that amount of variation has been definitely reduced. And there's a gray line in the middle there, which is the set point. And if you notice, the amount of blue over the line and under the line is about the same. So when it goes to a bin, it's going to pretty much equalize. The line below, the orange line, is the speed that the Dryer Master is running the dryer at. And you can see that bounces around a little bit, which, if you think about it, makes sense because the inlet's bouncing around different moistures. So at different points in the drying process, you're going to want to run at different speeds. Now, if people can see, there's the first red dotted line, the vertical line there. If you look at where the green is, the green line, after that red line, red dotted line, the green starts to go up. So the inlet moisture is getting wetter. And so what does the Dryer Master do? It starts to slow. If you look at the orange line, it starts to slow down the dryer. But it doesn't do it right away. It's waiting for that wetter grain to hit the hot zone of the dryer, and then it'll slow it down gradually. So what it's trying to do is make the adjustment to the speed at the right time. Because if you waited until that wet grain came out of the dryer too wet, it's a little bit too late. So it's trying to, that's the benefit of having an inlet moisture sensor, is seeing what's coming and being able to adjust the control as the moisture hits the hot zone of the dryer.
So obviously the wet sensor is a fairly integrated portion of the entire system.
Oh, definitely. It's like, otherwise what you end up, and you'll see this sometimes when operators are only working off the outlet sensor, you kind of get chasing your tail, because what happens is, let's say you're targeting 14% moisture, and now you get some 13 coming out. You go, uh-oh, I better speed up. Well, you're reacting to what came out. You're not going to fix that 13. So they speed up the dryer, and then 2 hours later, it's coming out at 15.5 or something. They go, oops, too wet now. They got to slow it down, and they start oscillating back and forth because they're doing what we call after the fact control. So the idea is really the way Dryer Master does. You want to do it at the beginning of the process.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. So earlier you stated one of the benefits of a DM510 is to allow you to remotely control your dryer. Can you show us how this works?
Yeah, so I mean, basically Dryer Master has we call it an app, but it's just browser based, and anybody can look at a little example we have running online, and it's very similar to what you would see if you had a Dryer Master. You just have to be able to get internet to the Dryer Master panel, wired internet to the Dryer Master panel. And then you can check out our demo at my.dryermaster.com. No www required. And then you just use demo. It'll ask for a username and a password, and you just use demo, D-E-M-O, all lowercase. And so on this slide, we show kind of the examples you get. You get your outlet moisture, outlet grain temperature, the set point, and then the inlet in the green box, the inlet moisture and temperature. The red box is your drying temperature, and the orange box is the speed you're running at. And then below that, you can switch modes. So you can go to automatic, which lets the dryer master set the speed, or you can go to manual and you can set the speed yourself from your phone. And if you're an automatic and you want to change your set point for moisture, you can do that from your phone as well. The dryer master can also, the DM Mobile can also send you a text if there's an alarm. So let's say, for example, the outlet moisture went high or low, and you set these alarm limits. It can send you a text to let you know that something's happening, so you don't, go back 2 hours later and see that something happened. You can also download a week's worth of data. So there's 10-minute averages that are stored on the dryer master on the DM Mobile, and you can just download that into a spreadsheet type file.
Perfect. Oh, it really doesn't matter what platform you're operating, whether it's an iPad or a phone or a PC. All different platforms have access to that.
Yeah, it works on, I mean, don't try it on Internet Explorer 4.0 or something like that, but any relatively modern browser is fine. And you don't even have to go to the App Store to download anything. It's just straight based off the web.
Yeah. So going back a little bit to calibration, how often should an operator take samples to confirm the moisture content of the grain coming out of the dryer?
That's probably one of the most common questions we have. And there's no real one answer. We have all kinds of different operations that have it. So, you could be at an elevator where they're running, 10,000 bushels an hour, and they have people there all the time to watch the dryer. And they, I have some sites that they'll still, even with Dryer Master, they're testing every half hour. That's fine. And then you have other sites where someone's not around that often, and they may only test a couple of times a day. And the couple of key things. One, we find, initially at least, most people will test more frequently at the beginning. And then it's a matter of developing a comfort level and with your site. And obviously, if you're drying all your own product and it's a pretty consistent product, you're probably going to you'll probably end up calibrating less. If you're drying from a whole bunch of different places with different varieties and things like that, you may end up calibrating a bit more. The key thing though in calibration is we would rather you do fewer calibrations, but ones that are well done. And a well done calibration for us would be, like I said, you take a sample over that 30 seconds we talked about, and then you run 3 tests through your benchtop, and you take the average. So let's say we go take our sample and we get a 14.2, 14.4, and a 14.6 of our 3 samples from our bucket. So my first question to people is, which one's right? You go, well, it's the same bucket. How do I have 3 different moistures? That's quite possible. And in, depending on the product, it can be even a wider range sometimes. The answer is the average, right? There's no one specific thing. Each one is correct for the sample it took, but what's coming out of your dryer, your best guess would be it's an average. And so better to do the 3 tests and do an average rather than just grab a cup more frequently, right? So that's really the key thing. The other thing we tell people about calibration is you don't really want to calibrate for the first, hour or 2 you're drying during the day, because when you start up, the moisture gradient and the temperature gradient in the kernel is going to be different than if the grain has been in the dryer for 2 or 3 hours in the heat, okay? And so because water behaves differently at different temperatures, and we're measuring water, the closer the conditions are to the day before, when you were drying, the better. So really for the first, hour or 2 when you start up, don't bother about calibrating. Just wait till that grain is a bit warmer coming up before you calibrate.
Perfect. Well, I think I think we're on to the question period now.
All right.
Yes, so that summarizes the presentation. If you have any questions, use the Q&A box. Again, this is found on the right-hand side of your screen. Just type your question in the box and hit send, and it will show up for us. We do have a few questions to start. So the first question, Chris, is, do different grains make a difference?
Definitely. Different grains will dry differently, and different grains will have different calibrations for the moisture sensor. So with the dryer master, we have it set up that you can run 8 different products. So each grain would be a different product. So they would have its own drying model and its own calibration for its sensors. So yes, definitely they'll work differently.
Okay, thank you, Chris. The next question, does the dryer master adjust to the heat?
No, this is also a very frequent question we get from people. Does dryer master adjust the temperature of the grain? So remember when I said at the very beginning, we have this thing called dead time or control delay? So if I change the speed of the dryer, I could be waiting 2 to 3 hours to know if I made the right change. Now let's say I'm going to adjust the speed and the temperature. Then 2 to 3 hours later, I see the change, but I don't know how much was the temperature and how much was the speed. So when we did the initial research a number of years ago, we basically said, you know what, in some situations, you might be able to get slightly better performance, but in a lot of situations, you're going to be a lot worse off. So what we said is, no, let's stick to, we control the speed. If the operator wants to make a change to the temperature, they can make a change, and we will make an initial guess on our model as to the effect that will have. And so we take that into account in what we do, but we don't actually adjust the temperature. But you know what you can do in the dryer master is you will set a maximum speed that you want to run at, and this is usually where it comes in. Somebody's running, and let's say they're running 1,000 bushels an hour, and that's the maximum their takeaway system can handle. So they're running 1,000 bushels an hour, and the grain's still coming out too dry. Well, the dryer master wants to speed up, but the 1,000 is the maximum you can do. So at that point, the operator should reduce the temperature, right? And so it's usually only when you hit limits like that temperature really needs to be adjusted.
Okay. Thank you. And one more question. Does the DM510 alleviate the usefulness of temperature monitoring in the grain columns?
Ben, do you want to do that one?
Sure. No, it absolutely does not. We still want to be monitoring grain temperature in the grain columns to make sure that we're not overheating the grain during the drying process. That's still a really important aspect of grain drying, is making sure your grain is not exceeding maximum temperatures for the types of grains that you're actually drying.
Okay. Last call for any questions. I don't see any further questions in our Q&A. Chris and Ben, did you have anything else you wanted to add before we wrap up?
So there is one question in the chat, and it's asked about how the dryer master communicates with an iPad or computer. I think we somewhat covered that in the automation portion. It doesn't really matter what the format is or what the platform is. You go to the dryer master site and it connects you directly to the dryer master.
Yeah, I mean, the setup on this is really, in most cases, is really pretty straightforward. The only thing you need to do is there need to be a wired connection between the dryer master and a router or wireless access point or something. There has to be a wired connection, like a connection from the router to the dryer master. And in 95% of the cases, it's just a matter of plugging it into both ends, and you should be good to go.
So I guess I just have one sort of ad lib question here, Chris. So what prevents me from connecting, me as an operator, or me as Joe Public, from connecting to any dryer master dryer that's connected on the network?
basically you have a user, each person gets their own username and password.
Right.
And so that's how it's password protected. So. And the passwords are very strange, so.
Yes, they are.
So do you have any other questions, comments? I take from the silence that no further questions. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. And thank you, Chris and Ben, for a very informative and helpful presentation. I hope all of you enjoy the rest of your day. And that's it. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.